What unsettled them wasn't what you said, it was what you didn't say. Because they were prepared for noise. They were prepared for emotion, for confrontation, for that familiar cycle where tension builds, you react, they withdraw, and the dance continues. That's the rhythm they understand. That's the environment where they feel, paradoxically, in control. But when you chose silence, real silence, not passive-aggressive distance, not strategic withdrawal, but genuine emotional stillness, you removed the very framework they rely on to navigate connection. And that's where the disruption begins. See, most people assume silence means weakness or surrender or even indifference. But in this context, your silence wasn't empty, it was intentional. It was the absence of reaction in a space that depended on your reaction to survive. And psychologically, that creates something incredibly powerful, a vacuum. Human beings are wired to seek resolution, to close loops, to make sense of emotional exchanges. When there's no response, no closure, no visible struggle, the mind doesn't relax. It spirals, it searches, it replays. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this is especially destabilizing. Because they've built their entire relational strategy around managing distance. They anticipate intensity so they can justify retreat. They expect pursuit so they can regulate closeness. But you didn't give them intensity. You didn't give them pursuit. You stepped outside the script entirely, per knee, and now there's nothing for them to push against. That's the part people underestimate, the power of removing friction. When you argue, when you chase, when you try to be understood, you're still participating in the dynamic. You're still giving them something to respond to, something to manage, something to keep the cycle alive. But silence is different. Silence doesn't engage. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't explain itself. It simply is. And in that stillness, something shifts. Because now, instead of focusing on your reaction, they're left with their own. Instead of analyzing your words, they start analyzing your absence. Questions begin to form not because you asked them to, but because there's nothing else to hold on to. Why didn't they fight? Why didn't they try to fix this? Why does it feel like something unresolved is just sitting here? That unresolved feeling is key. It lingers. It doesn't give them the clean emotional exit they're used to. There's no pragmatic ending to justify the distance. No final argument to point to and say, this is why it didn't work. Instead, there's ambiguity. And ambiguity is uncomfortable, especially for someone who relies on emotional detachment to feel safe. Your silence didn't give them a reason. It gave them a question. And questions have a way of echoing. Over time, that echo grows louder, not quieter. Because without new input, the mind recycles old moments. It replays conversations, reinterprets your behavior, searches for missed signals. And here's where it gets even more profounder. Silence begins to take on meaning far beyond what any explanation could have achieved. It starts to represent finality. Not the kind that's announced, but the kind that's demonstrated. You didn't say, I'm done. You showed it. And there's a certain gravity in that kind of action. Words can be debated, dismissed, or misunderstood. But behavior, consistent, quiet, unshaken behavior becomes undeniable. It communicates something deeper than emotion. It communicates decision. That's what they felt. Not anger, not rejection in the conventional sense, but a shift in your internal state. A realization that you were no longer participating in something that required you to lose yourself just to keep it going. And that realization, expressed through silence, carries a weight that's hard to ignore because it forces a comparison between who you were when you were trying and who you became when you stopped. And that contrast is what lingers in their mind. The version of you that engaged, explained, and stayed versus the version that simply left without resistance, without noise, without a fight. It's not that silence is inherently powerful. It's that your silence marked a boundary they didn't see coming. One that didn't ask for permission, didn't seek validation, didn't require agreement. It just existed. And in doing so, it changed the entire emotional equation. Because now, the story doesn't revolve around conflict. It revolves around absence. And absence has a way of revealing things that presence often conceals: value, impact, and the true weight of what's no longer there. So what broke them wasn't a harsh word or a dramatic ending. It was the quiet realization that there was nothing left to respond to, nothing left to control, nothing left to return to in the same way. You didn't raise your voice. You removed it. What made the shift so profound wasn't just that you stopped reacting, it's that you stopped pursuing. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because in dynamics shaped by avoidance, pursuit isn't just behavior, it's currency. It's the very thing that keeps the emotional structure intact. As long as you were chasing, there was movement. There was energy flowing in one direction. You reaching, them retreating. You questioning, them withholding. You trying to close the gap while they controlled the distance. And in that pattern, even if it felt painful to you, it felt familiar to them, predictable, manageable. But the moment you stopped chasing, you didn't just pause the dynamic, you dismantled it. Because now, there's no forward pressure, no one trying to pull them closer. No one reinforcing their role as the one who gets to decide how much connection is allowed. And without that structure, something unexpected happens. The sense of control they quietly relied on begins to slip. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, in ways they can't quite name. You have to understand, avoidant patterns are not just about avoiding closeness, they're about regulating it, keeping it at a distance that feels safe. And pursuit plays a critical role in that. When someone is chasing, they can calibrate their response. They can give just enough, withdraw just enough, maintain the illusion of balance while never fully surrendering control. But you didn't give them that opportunity. You stepped back completely. And in doing so, you've removed the very mechanism they use to feel secure. Now there's no one initiating, no one bridging the silence, no one signaling, I'm still here, still invested, still willing. And that absence doesn't feel like relief, it feels like uncertainty, because now the roles are unclear, the script is gone, the dynamic they understood no longer applies. And here's where the real shift happens. When you stop chasing, you don't just create distance, you create value. Not artificially, not as a tactic, but rather as a result of a combination of factors, but as a natural consequence of self-withdrawal. Human perception is deeply tied to accessibility. What is always available is often taken for granted. What withdraws, what becomes scarce, what is no longer easily reached, that's what the mind begins to reassess. It's not about playing games, it's about altering presence. When you were always there, always trying, always willing to engage, your value was constant, but it was also expected. It became part of the background, something they didn't have to question because it never changed. But when you left, when you truly stepped out of that role, you interrupted that expectation. And suddenly, they're not interacting with your presence anymore. They're confronting your absence. And absence has weight. It forces comparison. It highlights what used to be there without needing to argue for its importance. It creates a contrast between when you were and now that you're not. And in that contrast, something shifts in perception. They begin to see you not as the one who chased, but as the one who stopped. And that carries a different kind of power. Because stopping isn't passive, it's decisive. It signals a threshold has been reached. That something within you changed, not impulsively, not emotionally in the moment, but fundamentally. You reached a point where continuing no longer made sense. Where your energy was no longer available to sustain something that required you to give more than you received. And that realization, even if unspoken, is felt. It's felt in the silence, in the lack of follow-up, in the absence of effort where there used to be so much of it. And that shift creates a kind of psychological tension they're not used to holding. Because now, if anything is going to happen, it would have to come from them. And that's unfamiliar territory. The one who once held the position of being pursued is now left with a choice. Step forward or let it go. But stepping forward requires something they've spent a long time avoiding: initiative, vulnerability, risk. And letting it go? That requires accepting that something real has ended without their control over how it ended. Either way, the comfort of the old dynamic is gone. And what replaces it is a quiet awareness that you didn't just stop chasing them, you chose yourself. That's the part that lands the deepest, because it reframes everything. It's no longer about whether they were ready, or whether they needed space, or whether the timing was right. Becomes about your decision to no longer participate in a pattern that diminished you. And that decision, once made, is difficult to reverse, not because of pride, but because of clarity. You saw something for what it was, and you acted accordingly. So now, when they think about you, they're not just remembering someone who cared. They're remembering someone who walked away from caring in a way that cost them. And that leaves an impression, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, persistent, unresolved, because the chase is gone. And with it, the version of you they thought would always be there. You didn't lose them. You removed yourself from a position where you were never meant to stay. And then something even more subtle but far more destabilizing begins to unfold. It's not just that you stopped chasing. It's that you stepped outside the range of their influence entirely. Because before you left, there was a kind of invisible thread connecting your reactions to their behavior. They didn't need to say much. Sometimes they didn't need to say anything at all. A delayed response, a shift in tone, a moment of withdrawal, and you would feel it. You would adjust. You would lean in, ask questions, try to restore balance. And in doing so, without realizing it, you were responding to cues they had learned to rely on. That's how emotional control often operates in these dynamics, not through dominance, but through predictability. They knew on some level how you would respond. Not perfectly, not consciously, but enough to maintain a sense of orientation. If they pulled back, you would move closer. If they became distant, you would seek clarity. If they left something unresolved, you would try to resolve it. And that pattern created a kind of rhythm, one where your emotional movement filled the gaps their distance created. But when you walked away without resistance, that rhythm broke, and what replaced it wasn't just silence, it was unpredictability. Now they can't anticipate your reaction because there is no reaction. They can't test the connection because you're no longer engaging in the test. They can't rely on your emotional availability to stabilize the distance because that availability is no longer being offered. And that creates something deeply uncomfortable, a loss of reference. Human beings orient themselves through patterns. We understand people not just by who they are, but by how they respond. And when those responses disappear, especially in a dynamic where those responses were once consistent, it disrupts the entire mental map. They don't know where they stand with you anymore. And more importantly, they don't know if they still have access to you in the same way. That's where the loss of control becomes real. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a visible collapse, but in the quiet realization that the emotional levers they once had are no longer connected. They can't pull you back in with distance. They can't trigger a reaction through silence. They can't create that familiar push-pull dynamic that kept things moving without requiring full vulnerability. Because you've stepped out of it completely. And what's left is a kind of psychological gap they can't easily bridge. They may try at first to interpret it, to assume it's temporary, that you'll return, that you'll reach out, that this is just another phase in the cycle. But as time passes and your behavior remains consistent, no reaction, no pursuit, no re-entry into the me dynamic, that assumption starts to weaken. And in its place, something else begins to form. A question not about what you're doing, but about what has changed within you. Because people don't usually become this still without a reason. They don't usually detach this cleanly unless something fundamental has shifted in how they see the situation. And that realization carries weight, because it suggests that your absence isn't reactive, it's intentional. It's not a moment. It's a decision. Decisions, once recognized, are harder to dismiss. This is where the internal conflict begins to surface. On one hand, there's the instinct to maintain distance, to stay within the comfort zone of emotional independence. But on the other, there's a growing awareness that the dynamic they once understood no longer exists, and that you are no longer positioned within reach in the same way. That tension doesn't resolve easily, because engaging now would require something different. It would require stepping into uncertainty, initiating without knowing how you'll respond, risking vulnerability without the safety net of your predictable reactions. And for someone who has structured their relational behavior around avoiding that exact risk, this becomes a point of friction, not external friction, internal. And that's the shift you created. You moved the tension from the relationship into them, without confrontation, without pressure, without needing to explain or demand anything, just by removing your participation. And in doing so, you revealed something important, not about them, but about the dynamic itself. That it was sustained not just by their distance, but by your engagement with that distance. That the control they appeared to have was, in part, dependent on your willingness to respond to it. Once that response disappeared, so did the structure. And now, what they're left with isn't power, it's ambiguity. They don't know if reaching out will work. They don't know if, you'll respond the way you used to. They don't know if the connection still exists in the same form, or if it's already been redefined by your absence. And that uncertainty lingers, because it can't be resolved from a distance. It would require movement, initiative, a shift in behavior. But that shift comes at a cost, the cost of stepping outside the role they've been comfortable in. So they sit with it, with the awareness that something has changed and the inability to control what that change means. And that's what unsettles them. Not your departure alone, but the loss of influence over how that departure unfolds. You didn't just leave the dynamic. You became someone they could no longer predict, manage, or quietly guide through distance. And in that transformation, you took something back that was never meant to be negotiated in the first place: your autonomy. You stopped reacting. You stopped adjusting. You stopped being available to a pattern that required you to stay within its boundaries. And in doing so, you didn't just remove yourself from their control, you made it irrelevant. And after the silence, after the absence, after the loss of control settles into something real, something they can no longer dismiss, another layer begins to surface. One that is far less comfortable than anything that came before it. Because when you were there, actively engaging, trying to understand, trying to hold the connection together, you were also, without intending to, absorbing a certain amount of emotional weight. You were participating in a dynamic that allowed them to stay externally focused on your reactions, your expectations, your responses. And as long as that focus remained outward, there was very little need for them to turn inward. Your presence gave them something to orbit around. But your absence removed that center, and now there's nothing left to engage with externally. No conversation to manage, no emotional cues to interpret, no pressure to respond or withdraw in real time. What's left is stillness. And in that stillness, attention begins to shift away from you and toward themselves. This is where the real discomfort begins, because self-awareness, especially for someone who has spent a long time avoiding emotional depth, is not a gentle process. It doesn't arrive as clarity. It arrives as friction, as a kind of internal noise that's difficult to organize, thoughts that don't quite settle, feelings that don't have an immediate outlet. And without you there to engage with, there's nothing to distract from it. They may try at first to replace the dynamic, to fill the space with other interactions, other distractions, other forms of engagement that feel lighter, less demanding. But something about your absence doesn't replicate easily. Not because you were perfect, or because the connection was ideal, but because of what your presence required of them. It required a level of depth they weren't fully prepared to meet. And now that depth hasn't disappeared, it's been internalized. Moments begin to resurface, not in a dramatic way, but in fragments. Conversations that ended too quickly, opportunities for honesty that were avoided, instances where closeness was available but not received. And these moments don't come with clear conclusions. They come with questions, not about you, about themselves. Why did I pull away there? Why did I shut down instead of responding? Why did something real feel like something I needed to escape? These are not easy questions to sit with, because they don't point outward. They don't assign blame. They don't offer the relief of saying, it just didn't work. They require a different kind of engagement, one that is reflective rather than reactive. And reflection, for someone used to avoiding, feels unfamiliar. There's no immediate resolution, no clear answer that restores comfort. Just a growing awareness that the pattern didn't just happen, it was participated, maintained, repeated. And your absence is what made that visible. Because as long as you were present, the dynamic could continue without being fully understood. It could move forward without being examined. But once you stepped away, the movement stopped. And what remains when movement stops is structure. They begin to see the shape of things more clearly, not all at once, not in a single moment of realization, but gradually through repetition, through the quiet return of the same thoughts, the same questions, the same unresolved impressions that no longer have a place to go. And in that repetition, something starts to form. Not necessarily change, not immediately, but awareness. And awareness is where everything begins. Because once someone becomes aware of their own patterns, they can no longer experience them in the same unconscious way. There's a shift, subtle but significant, from simply acting to observing the act itself. And that observation creates distance from the automatic response. Distance from the instinct to withdraw without understanding why. Distance from the comfort of not having to question their own behavior. But here's the part that often goes unspoken. Awareness doesn't guarantee transformation. It doesn't suddenly make someone ready. It doesn't instantly resolve the tension between wanting connection and fearing it. What it does is remove the illusion of simplicity. It makes the pattern visible. And once something is visible, it becomes harder to ignore. That's the impact of your departure. You didn't force them to change. You didn't confront them into growth. You didn't explain their behavior back to them in a way that demanded accountability. You simply left. And in doing so, you removed the distraction that allowed avoidance to continue without reflection. Now, whatever they do next, whether they grow, whether they repeat the pattern elsewhere,